I'm going to tell you a story about how I messed up so bad as a game master, it opened my eyes forever about how not to run a game. This video is going to be a little different than typical gaming commentary because it's going to focus on the specific gaming experience that I think at one time or another we've all gone through. No matter how long you've been running games, whether it's been for decades, weeks, or you haven't even ran your first game yet, no matter which game system you're using, there is going to be a turning point where you discover you're not as good as you'd hoped you'd be. Eventually you'll get good, but like characters, you have to level with your experiences, and you can't do that without messing up at least once. So I'm going to give you a bit of backstory on what led up to this heinous event, so that there will be some context. Unlike most people who play tabletop games, my experience didn't actually start out with Dungeons & Dragons. I had heard of it, and I had no idea what it was or how it was played. No, it wasn't until I was around 14 or 15 that I was introduced to gaming by my best friend in high school, who at the time I'd only known for really a couple months. We were big into comics and toys, and one day he showed up to school with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game from Palladium. This was roughly around 1990, so the Turtles had already hit mainstream by that time, with the cartoon and toys, so we knew at least on that front exactly what we were getting into. From there, us and another guy we knew would play pretty consistently in high school, and over the next few years, we moved from TMNT up to Heroes Unlimited, and then later Rifts, all within the span of a year or two. And for the most part, I was running games, but we'd switch off from time to time. I really enjoyed it though, and I loved making characters, but what I really loved was making the world in which the characters would play in. So it was never a situation of being obligated to run games because no one else would and I drew the short straw, but rather I wanted to do it, and that worked out for everyone. Now, this is a little bit of a long story, but trust me, there's a payoff. Of course, you can just skip to the end of how I fucked everything up, but I wanted to make sure that the groundwork was here for that context. Anyway, when making characters, it was in some ways an arms race to make the most optimized characters possible. I know in D&D circles that's generally frowned upon, but in Rifts it kind of went hand in hand, especially when you had near limitless options. One of the weird things we did anytime a new character got made was to pair off into PvP matches. That term really wasn't around back in the early 90s, but it is what we did. We called them holodeck battles, that basically amounted to the players being in a mapped environment we had made explicitly for that purpose. They would start out on different parts of the island, find weapon caches, and use the terrain and structures as tactical resources, and I, as the game master, would adjudicate the fights and throw some hazards at them as well. These fights existed solely outside the normal game, and were only here to A, pass the time when no session was scheduled, and B, find your own character's strengths and weaknesses. One character in particular sort of became the benchmark to try to beat. His name was Achilles. He was mostly based out of the transdimensional Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games as a mutant T-Rex from millions of years ago who, thanks to the additional Bio-E points, had most, if not all, of the mutation perks since he was in the Rift's future. On top of that, he had several major superpowers from Heroes Unlimited. The ones that I can recall off the top of my head were Alter Physical Structure, Ice, and Metal, which somehow made him as a metal creature that was coated in ice when his powers were on, as well as Super Physical Strength and Physical Prowess. And as far as I can recall, these powers were the result of random rolls, which we often did when creating those characters out of Heroes Unlimited, so it wasn't necessarily a conscious choice, just how it came to be. And unlike the mythological Achilles, this character seemed to have no weaknesses to speak of. We made a lot of characters to do various missions and storylines, but the ever-present Kill Achilles was always there to some degree. So, with all that out of the way, over the years we picked up some new friends and new players, and I was running a Rifts campaign that was set in Mexico, which, in case you aren't intimately familiar with the Rift setting, it's vampire country. Over the course of the adventure, in sessions, they found a village that was populated by humans that were ultimately discovered to be the cattle for the master vampire, Escorpion. They discovered his palace, were making way up the cliffs and hills to reach it, going at a fairly good job tearing through the wild vampires and human shields. Turns out they were a bit more of a ends justifies the means kind of guys than Escorpion predicted. Before they made it up all the way to the palace, things took a turn for the worse. Escorpion was a techno-wizard, and I had come up with this freeze ray gun that used gems and a basilisk eye as part of the construction. A glowing beam would shoot out of it, and it would turn anything it hit that failed the saving throw into stone. Somehow, through the virtue of bad rolling and sheer chance, he targeted Achilles with the device. The save failed, and Achilles was turned to stone. Everyone's jaw dropped. This was insanity because while he was certainly able to be hurt, he'd never really been that close to character death. So in a panic, the remaining group retreated and tried to figure out what to do next. Now you might be asking, how is that being a terrible game master? Well, it's not. We're not even to the bad part yet. The player of Achilles whipped out the books, started making his new characters. And as a side note, unlike what you see a trend of today in tabletop gamers, people don't invest their life stories in the characters they play. They mourn and move on. But it didn't stop there. They weren't content with going at it again, only to fail again. These guys recruited a bunch of friends who didn't really game with us all that often to make their own characters and bring back reinforcements to curb stomp Escorpion. So now we're running a one-shot showdown with a group of about 11 people, about twice as many that went the first time, and by far the largest group that it ever ran. And they headed back up to the palace and were ready to burn it to the ground with everyone and everything in it. What the players didn't know at the time is that the freeze ray gun was actually only a temporary condition. After about 1d6 hours, the subject would revert back to its normal form. But even though the players didn't know this, Escorpion knew it. What he had done at that point after Achilles was pretty much already written off as dead was restrain him and turn him into a secondary vampire the moment the petrification wore off. So imagine the group's surprise when they steamrolled their way to the palace throne room. Escorpion smugly stood there, snapped his fingers. I plopped the newly painted miniature of Achilles, this time with gray skin, onto the table. That in and of itself was a huge WTF moment. He was a vampire, completely under the control of Escorpion, and had all of his previous superpowers. It was almost a 12-1 battle, and things still weren't going well for the group. This was the battle to end all battles. So right now you're probably asking, is that the bad part? No, but it's coming. As the fight drew on, as a last-ditch effort, one of the players who were brought in for reinforcements, specifically with his newly created vampire hunter character, said, "You know what? I'm just going to throw this wooden stake at him from across the room and get him directly in the heart." I thought for a moment, and I finally said, "The only way you can do that is if you roll a natural 20. He whipped it out, rolled it, and it landed on a natural 20. Holy shit! The entire table jumped out of their seats. This was the most epic conclusion to the most epic battle ever. I knocked the miniature over, and then a few seconds later, and God help me, it chokes me up just thinking about what I'm about to tell you. I said, wait a minute. He's made of ice-coated metal, which is MDC. There's no way the wooden stake would have penetrated that. It would just shatter on impact. So I stood the miniature up, and we resumed the battle. And that was the worst thing that I had ever done as a game master, and to this day, it makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about it. We were a great group of players, and they abided by my on-the-fly decision. They half-heartedly whittled Achilles down until he was disabled, took his now staked corpse along with Escorpion, threw them both into the Rio Grande River from a helicopter, and it was a win. But man, it was an empty win. I did the unthinkable. I didn't realize it right away, but it changed my outlook on what it really means to be a better game master. I took away their ultimate moment of victory over a technicality in a game whose rules barely worked half the time anyway. Since that time, almost 30 years ago, most of us have gone our separate ways. But when I do touch base with them, that was a moment no one has ever forgotten, and not for the right reasons. I don't think anyone holds a particular grudge against me any worse than I do against myself. But the moral of the story is clear. Do not take away from the players doing something amazing. If you're still here for the story, I hope you can learn from what I did so that you never have to do it in your games. And if you've already done things like that, or think that it's the right way to play by the rules, I'm making air quotes by the way, don't do it. Let the players shine. By the way, if you haven't already done it, go ahead and subscribe now and click the bell icon to get notified when new videos are released. And tell me down in the comments what your horror stories as a game master or as a player who had to endure a shitty decision on your game master's part. And let me know what you think. I'm very curious how this has played out with different groups over different years. Thanks again. Goodbye.